Hi, and welcome to the Team Deakins podcast. This podcast is a dialogue between Roger and James Deakins, often joined in the conversation by a guest. It's very informal, and we never know where it will go. We're connecting through Zoom, so bear that in mind when you hear the audio. If you'd like to submit a question or topic, please do so by emailing pod, P-O-D, at rogerdeakins.com. Today, we are really pleased to have with us a very special guest. He's an image maker who can tell a story within a single frame, captured in what Henri Cartier-Bresson called the decisive moment. We're so happy to have this opportunity to talk with a still photographer who's been an inspiration to so many for so many years, and, from the look of his recent work, will be for many more years to come. It's an honor and a pleasure to welcome AlexWebb. Alex, thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you for coming. I just want to add, it is such a pleasure to be able to talk to you. Your work has been such an inspiration to me, and I know for many, many people that I know in the film industry, but it's also been something of a mystery to me. So I'm really glad to have this opportunity to talk with you.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to be here. I certainly have always liked your work tremendously. So it's an honor.
Thank you, Alex.
And if you could tell me how you got to where you are now, did you always want to make images from a child, or did you find it later, or what?
Not necessarily as a photographer. I come from a family of artists. My mother was a painter, draftsman, and sculptor, and my father was an editor, publisher, a secretive fiction writer, and an occasional photographer. And my brother is a painter. He teaches at Pratt in Brooklyn. And my sister, who tried to go into science, into biology, ended up being an ornithological illustrator. So it was it was hard to escape the visual arts in my family. But it wasn't originally photography, even though I did learn photographic technique from my father when I was quite young, when I was about 10. But didn't really like the smell of the darkroom particularly. But I sort of dabbled on different things. I mean, I dabbled in some just terrible paintings and some even worse sculptures. And actually, at one point, I did make some little tiny films with a single 8 movie camera. They were sort of little skits. They were like really bad Monty Python, often starring my brother. And there was another little film that I made about an accident from 3 perspectives, clearly influenced by Rashomon. But
brilliant.
But one of the things that doing those made me realize is that I didn't want to work with a lot of other people. I was always having to recruit my brother or my friends to be in my stupid little films. And so I turned back to photography. And I began poking around the streets of Boston and Brattleboro, Vermont, which was near the school that I went to. And, I think I was, and this is really almost a cliche, I was inspired, I think, by 2 books in particular, The Decisive Moment and Frank's the Americans. Too many photographers say that those were the 2 key books. But there were other influences. Some early Ray Metzger influenced me. There was a series that published in Aperture called My Camera and I in the Loop, and some of Lee Friedlander's early work, particularly his social landscape stuff. So, in high school, I really, sort of re-embraced photography and pretty much have been doing it since then. There was a brief flirtation with fiction writing in college. Fortunately, the world was spared that. And so I've been doing it ever since.
But you went to Harvard and studied history and literature, right?
I did, though at the time I was extremely interested in photography, but I somehow didn't want to just go to an art school and just study photography. I wanted to sort of study some other things as well. I was very interested in literature also. And, knowing something about history seemed to feed into some aspects of what I might be interested in as a photographer.
You studied, I've read somewhere, you studied under Charles Harbert.
I did. During my sophomore year, I had sort of hit a sort of wall, kind of crisis with my photography. Going to Harvard, I worked very hard, I did well, and I was deeply unhappy. I wasn't photographing very much. And towards the end of my sophomore year, I sort of started to photograph a little bit again, and I wanted to see if, in fact, this was a direction I really wanted to go in. And so I took a workshop with Charlie Harbert that summer, and that really was profoundly influential. It wasn't so much necessarily what Charlie said, but I saw an example of a photographer who was surviving from his profession, but at the same time doing some of the work that he really cared about. And Charlie and I, we were working in some sort of somewhat similar areas. So there was a real connection. And that really convinced me that from then on, I was going to ease off my last 2 years at Harvard in my academic studies, and I was going to concentrate much more on my photography, which I did.
Is that a big fear when you're thinking of going into photography? How am I going to support myself?
Well, I rapidly learned that yes, it was a big fear.
Yeah.
And it remains a big fear. I mean, because most of the time for doing work for clients, you're solving their problems, and I'm really interested in solving my problems with photography.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess while I was at art college, I felt I wanted to be a photographer. And at art college, Roger Main, and Roger Main.
I like Roger's work a lot.
Yeah, a lovely man. He was my tutor for a while. He wasn't there very much, but for a while, he really inspired me. But then there was that big worry about the outlets for photography, for work, were sort of diminishing. And it seemed a very hard profession to get into. So how did you start out? How did you make a living? You worked for the National Geographic at one time as well, did you?
Well, I have worked for Geographic, not as a staffer, but I have worked for Geographic.
Ah, right.
I moved to New York right after college in 1974, and I worked part-time as a picture researcher for several months, so I had some kind of income. And I began dragging my little portfolio of black and white pictures around to various different publications, and slowly managed to get a few jobs here and there. I mean, back then, it was possible to live a lot more cheaply than it is now.
Yeah.
I mean, I shared an apartment with a friend. It was together $250 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side of New York. So I was paying.
Oh my!
So I was paying $125 a month. I mean, New York used to be a really good renter's city, and that has changed considerably. So I lived very, very cheaply, and I did do these occasional assignments here and there, initially for the New York Times Week in Review section and the New York Times Magazine, some for Time Magazine, and slowly began to figure out how to survive as a photographer. I have to say that first probably year in New York, I don't think I did very much interesting photography. I was really learning how to take some pictures that would work for these publications. But that was exciting. It was exciting to learn how to do that and to begin to get published. It wasn't until 1975 when I made 2 trips, one to Haiti and one to the US-Mexico border, that I really began to feel that I began to do something more interesting with my work.
Right. What kind of assignments were you getting then when you were first starting? Was it kind of just local news?
Yes. Yeah. I mean,
really? Yeah.
For instance, there was I went and did a number of little projects on my own. I remember I borrowed a car from my parents and drove out to Western Massachusetts and did something. It was a lot of talk about unemployment at that particular time. And I did a little series of pictures in Chicopee, Massachusetts, a declining mill town, about unemployment there. Came back to New York, processed my film, made up a bunch of prints, and I showed them to a picture editor at Time Magazine who had expressed some interest in my work. And they said, "Oh, that's nice." And then I came in with something else, and they said, "Oh, that's nice." And then I got a call from them, and they asked me to go to Boston to do something about unemployment in Boston. Likewise, I did something on a nursing home during the time of a nursing home scandal. I think they paid, quote unquote, a holding fee for the work, meaning they gave me $200 to be able to hold the work off the market for a few weeks. So there were these little tiny assignments that I did largely around New York or New England. Yeah.
Charles Harbert said a couple of things that I think kind of relate to you. He said projects took away freedom and were a distraction. That's kind of what you're saying, really, isn't it? That if you're sent on an assignment, it's not a sort of personal exploration. You've got to do a job, tell a story.
I don't know the context of exactly in what context Charlie said that. But yes, I mean, I do think that doing an assignment, if you're a professional, you've got to solve the client's problem. You've got to do something that works for them. Now, I have always tried as much as possible to be looking for those things that excite me particularly simultaneously. And occasionally that works out for both of us. Occasionally the special picture that I find happens to slip into the magazine layout. Not necessarily all that much. And also, those special pictures only come along every once in a while anyway. They don't necessarily pop up when you go off for 2 days on an assignment. But, I think photographers have traditionally done this kind of dance where one way of getting funding for their work is to work for various publications, and they do some of their own work simultaneously. And how well it works also depends a little bit on the kind of photographer the person is. There are certain photographers whose basic impulse is to take pictures that work more easily within the general marketplace. There are others where it's a little more difficult. I mean, the kind of sort of more complex, more enigmatic pictures that I particularly like to take don't necessarily always easily fit into magazines, though occasionally they have.
Were you influenced by, if you think of photojournalism, I think of Don McCullin and Larry Burrows, Kudelka, Mark Rebold, really. But your work's not like that. Did that work influence you? I mean, Charles Harbert's work is kind of more, in a way, it's less photojournalistic. It's about much more about what Cartier-Bresson called the moment, the decisive moment. It's just some sort of something that's attracted him. It's not necessarily telling a story on an assignment. It's just some moment that is somehow attracted him. Your work seems more of that vein.
Yes. I mean, Charlie sort of went through a shift because Charlie early on did a lot of very direct and straightforward photojournalism. He worked in Cuba, he did work for National Geographic and so forth. But there was that switch in the early 70s, particularly when he brought out his book Travelogue, where he went in a decidedly more personal direction. And I was moving in that direction on my own, as a young photographer when I met Charlie. My photographic heroes were never, I didn't see pictures in magazines that much. I looked at photographic books. I mentioned The Decisive Moment and The Americans, but I remember David Heath's Dialogue with Solitude. Those were the kind of books that intrigued me. That was the kind of photography that intrigued me. It was work that appeared in books, occasionally in exhibitions, though I have to say back then there were comparatively few exhibitions. My goal was never to be published in Life magazine, for example.
Right. Charles also said, I don't take pictures, pictures take me. That seems to really imply to you somehow.
I love that phrase. And, I think Charlie actually in that same afterword, the Travelogue, said something or another about the difference between photographers and painters, where he said that it's about sort of the relationship of the photographer to the world. That if you put a painter in a room with his easel and brushes, he still can paint whatever he wants. He's only limited by his imagination. He can do a landscape, he can do an abstraction, a portrait, whatever. Whereas you put a photographer in that room and the photographer can take a gray picture, a black picture, a white picture, and maybe a self-portrait, and that's it. So there's something or another about that particular relationship with the world that is particularly unique for the process of photography. I think Charlie also said something that it wasn't just that he was looking for a picture was looking for him. Most of the time, they miss one another, but every once in a while they come together.
Yeah.
Does that mean that when you're out and about in the old days, that you always have a camera with you, just in case?
That's interesting. When I was younger, that was definitely the case. But now I really find myself deciding that there are certain times that I'm going to focus and be attuned to the world, and other times less so. When I go off somewhere, I am like that, if I decide to go off for 2 weeks and work in a certain place. But day to day, when I'm home, I don't necessarily carry a camera.
It's interesting. There's again, I'm going on about Charles Harber, but I think there's sort of things about his work, and that's because you studied with him, albeit briefly maybe, but some of his work seems to lead to yours in a way. There's a photograph he took in Mexico, I think it is, on a ferry. And it's just some military people and then some women. And there's a big it's from inside a car, I think. So it's framed, but there's a big black, the window frame or something right across the middle of the image. But it's black and white. And I would have thought that could have been one of your photographs, but it would have to be in color. Can you tell us how you discovered color and it seemed to change your work completely? Although there's some of your black and white work that I think is quite amazing, but it seems you made a complete shift and discovered color. Sure. And I read somewhere it was because you read Graham Greene's book, The Comedians.
Well, it's a little more complicated than that. I'll start with Graham Greene, and then I'll move into color. Okay.
Okay.
So my first trip to Haiti in 1975 was partially inspired by reading Graham Greene's The Comedians. The novel fascinated me. It also scared me. And I went to Haiti for 3 weeks, working in black and white. Around the same time also, again, it was Greene. I read a short story of his, I think it's called Across the Bridge, which is set on the U.S.-Mexico border. And I read The Lawless Roads and Power and the Glory. And those inspired me to go to the U.S.-Mexico border around the same time in 1975. And those two trips really transformed me as a photographer in terms of what I was deciding to photograph. Before that, I'd photographed largely around New York and New England, and really hadn't considered the possibility of going places like the Caribbean or Mexico. And in these worlds, I found a kind of intensity and a kind of vibrancy that I found very exciting and contrasted tremendously with what I'd been doing in the United States. I mean, in 1975, I really felt that my photography in the United States was kind of reaching a dead end. I'd been taking some pictures, a lot of them north of Boston. They were kind of alienated and ironic, a little bit in the spirit of some of Charlie Harbett's stuff, some of Lee Friedlander's stuff, but they somehow weren't expansive. They weren't resonant. And I felt sort of at a dead end. I was stymied. And those trips just opened up other worlds entirely for me. And so for the next 3 years, I kept going back to the Caribbean and to the US-Mexico border and continued working in black and white for 3 years. But after 3 years, I suddenly realized there was something I wasn't dealing with. I wasn't dealing with the intense colors and the vibrant light of these places, where you feel that sort of intense color is almost embedded in the culture. And so I started working in color in late 78, early 1979. And that was the next huge shift for me, to start working in color. And basically, I've done so ever since. I mean, the other thing is, I think, is that color felt so much less explored. I mean, I remember in high school when I was first starting out as a photographer and going to Paris and taking some pictures. And everywhere I looked, I'd see, oh, there's a Cartier-Bresson, there's a Duano, there's a Brassai. And then in the streets of New York, I'd look around and say, oh, there's a Winogrand, there's a Friedlander.
Yeah.
Haiti, the US-Mexico border, seemed utterly unexplored, especially when I turned to color, And it was an embrace of a kind of color that I think was different than a lot of the color that was starting to be done. I mean, it was not that sort of more muted, vernacular American color. It was embracing the hot reds and the brilliant yellows of these places. And so that's why I turned to color.
It seems, I mean, I find there's very few photographers that can work in color. I mean, the ones that are obvious to me is like William Eccleston, that I think maybe inspired you in some way because of his vibrant colors. But also William Albert Allard, I think his color work is brilliant. And Harry Gruyère,
yeah.
Do you know?
Yeah,
Gruyère. Yeah. He takes amazing color pictures, but so different than yours. And then there's Patrick Zachman. Do you know Patrick?
I know Patrick, sure. Miguel Rio Branco also. a Brazilian
All right, I'll
photographer.
write that down.
Yeah, particularly his early work. There's a book called, I don't know, Dulce Sudor Amargo or something like that. I think it means soft, sweet sweat in Portuguese. But
Oh,
it's
great.
very,
Good.
very,
You
very
have the
special.
best titles. You guys have the best titles for your books, which brings me to Under Grudging Sun.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us about that. How did that come about? And how do you work? Did you just go, the first trip you made, for instance, did you just go by yourself, get a plane ticket, go and just walk the streets? So how did that come about?
Well, my first trip to Haiti was actually before I started work on Under Grudging Sun. I went in 1975 and work in black and white. And, it was very intense. And, as I said before, it convinced me to continue working in Haiti and in the Caribbean. I made another trip in 1979. I actually managed to get an assignment from American Geo to photograph Haiti in 1979. And I also went in 1980 on my own. So there was this ongoing interest in Haiti. And 79, 80 were sort of my first years of starting to work in color. And then I didn't go back to Haiti for a while. And then right after the fall of Baby Doc Duvalier in 86, I went back really sort of to take a look and see what was going on in Haiti after the fall of this 30-year regime. And, what I discovered there was a country that all of a sudden there seemed to be this openness and excitement that this regime was gone. There seemed to be a multitude of possibilities open to Haitians and Haitian society. And so I spent 3 weeks there in that first trip in 86, came back and looked at the film and realized I had to go back again. And it was sort of interesting because I was also, at that point, that was shortly after my first book, Hot Light, Half Made Worlds, had come out. And I had kind of thought that my next book would be a book on Mexico. But somehow Haiti pushed Mexico aside, and I didn't come back to doing a book on Mexico until 2014, many, many years later. That's what happens. There seemed to be an urgency about what was going on in Haiti. And so over those 2 years, I made, I believe 11 trips to Haiti, mostly on my own. The last trip, I did have an assignment from an Italian magazine. But, I was often there during news periods where, all these photographers I knew, I was kind of envious. They all were making money, shooting for Time and Newsweek. And I was there just doing my own thing, which ultimately was much better for me.
Yes.
Better, but nonetheless, it wasn't necessarily great for my bank account. So
was that strange, being somewhere like that, and those photojournalists come in, the reporters come in, and they cover a story for a few months. I remember I was doing a documentary for the ANC in Rhodesia when the war was going on, and one lunchtime, I was with the journalists, and we went to a cafe, and there was a whole load of journalists there, and they were all talking about, well, the news story's passed. Where should we go now? They were talking all the different places in the world they could go to get the next news story. That's I felt very uncomfortable with that. It's almost like news porn in a way.
I totally understand. I mean, this sort of sense of this news caravan that travels around the world from hotspot to hotspot, and once they're gone, that country disappears off the map in terms of the news. And then it comes back again 3 years later when they decide to return. No, I find that all very strange. And, my reasons for working in Haiti, I mean, I was there during times of intense news, but my reasons were largely out of a sense of curiosity. I mean, I'd read Graham Greene's Comedians. I was interested by this country, fascinated by it, baffled by it in many ways. It's a country of incredible sort of vibrancy, and there's a sense of life to Haiti. And at the same time, it's one of the most disturbing and tragic places on the planet. It's had a terrible history ever since the success of their original revolution. It's been sort of all downhill since then. So it's a place that when I was there, sometimes I almost felt that I had these two simultaneous feelings. One was that, oh, this is so amazing. I want to photograph here forever. And at the same time, I was saying to myself, I want to go to the airport and leave here as quick as possible. It was like this totally contradictory notions that coexisted with me all the time in Haiti. And sometimes I think that maybe photographing there was a way of trying to at least visually make sense of that fact that I could have those two notions simultaneously.
Does the idea of a book come before you take the pictures or after?
Look, I rarely have a book in mind. Now, obviously, I've reached a point where if I go somewhere and I'm serious about it, I will think, oh, maybe there's a possibility of a book, perhaps. But I specifically remember in Haiti on that first trip telling another photographer who'd been working in Haiti earlier the same year. I remember telling her, oh, no, you're probably doing a book, but I'm not doing a book. I'm just going to sort of, I'm just trying to figure out what makes sense out of this country. But, about a year later, I began to realize, oh, yeah, this book maybe there is a book here. And then even later, after the violence that took place during the November elections, I suddenly rethought it all and thought, why should I do a book? This is such a tragic event. Does it make any sense to do a book about this place? And then several months later, came back on my next trip to realize, oh, well, maybe it does make sense after all. So there are always these, sort of doubts and uncertainties about the process of making the book. You don't know exactly how long it is you're going to keep working on it. The Haiti book for me was a fairly short period. It was 2 years of work. My Mexico book is more than 30 years of work. Like my border book was 26 years of work. Clearly, there's certain places that I didn't want to let go of. I didn't want to stop working in those places. Haiti, after 2 years, I was ready to let go. So, but I think that doing any of these projects of mine, once I start getting involved in them, I realize I'm on a journey, but I really don't know when or where the destination lies. Each, and it's the photographs that sort of, if I look at the photographs, they lead me as to where the project is going to end up, where it goes, its direction.
Okay, it's a blunt question, really, I suppose.
Okay.
What are you trying to achieve with your photography? You said that your photography asks questions rather than provides answers. Can you elaborate on that? What do you see the purpose of your work, really?
Well, the purpose of my work, look, I hope on some level that my work adds to some kind of dialogue, whether it's about the place that I'm photographing, whether it's about photography, whether it's about seeing, that it adds in some way. I don't have any idea what way it ultimately will be. I don't have control of that. I don't have control of people's reactions. I know from experience the vast variety of reactions that individuals can have to a given photograph. I certainly couldn't begin to predict. But, the driving force is that this is something that intrigues me. This is something that I want to make some kind of statement about on some level. But really, a lot of it is a process of trying to make sense of the world and my photography. In terms of the question of, questions versus answers, I like pictures that are often a little enigmatic. You're not quite sure what's going on, or you feel like it's not like it's a picture of just that. It's a picture of that, and that. And there's a question is, how can all those things simultaneously coexist? And for me, that's much more about the way life is than about simple answers. The longer I live, the less I feel I know or can predict about what's going to happen in this world or how.
Boy, that's true.
Really, it's astonishing, and so I feel that by at least acknowledging the complexity and the mystery of the world, at least I'm making some kind of statement there, But I don't purport to have any answers whatsoever.
Yeah.
Do you ever feel guilt that a photograph is so strong because it's portraying someone else's tragedy? Does that make sense?
No, I understand what you're saying. Look, I think there's a very delicate line that I sometimes tread along. And I think all photographers sort of try and figure out their own moral compasses, and each of us decides how far we can go in a certain direction. Look, there are definitely times when I've taken a picture and I feel like uncomfortable with it, and I'm not going to show that picture. Or I'm in a situation where I feel that, yeah, these people have let me into their lives, but somehow I feel it's intrusive, it's too much, and I back off. So, I don't have any hard and fast rules. It's just a feeling that sometimes it seems a little wrong. And I can't say in advance what situation that is or whatever. But yeah, there are complications there, sure.
So do you end up knowing the subjects very well before you take the pictures, or do you sometimes grab the pictures and don't even know them? How do you work that with?
I work with what the world will give me. So, if I can walk in unobtrusively into a situation and seem comparatively invisible in photograph, I will. If I go into a situation, it's clear that people are very uncomfortable, or if I feel I've definitely got to explain what I'm doing, I do that. Sometimes you have to get to know people and hang out before you can even begin taking pictures. So I don't have any hard and fast rules. I mean, there's certain times, like, Gary Winogrand apparently just sort of walked through things like that and refused to say anything to anyone. I don't know if that's really true or not. But, I think that how you deal with the world also depends very much on who you are as a person. There's some photographers who feel a deep need to get to know people deeply, and they have long relationships with them. And there are others who don't. But as I said, I work with whatever the world will give me.
Roger, you stopped doing documentaries because of that dilemma, right?
I was doing documentaries, and I felt a bit voyeuristic, I suppose. And it was just a point in my career where people were offering me dramas to shoot. So it just felt more comfortable for me. But I had the same feelings exactly what you were saying, really. There's a sort of, you have to find your own moral compass, don't you, really, in a way?
Yeah, I think photography is a surprisingly complicated medium in that regard.
Yeah, for something seeming simple.
Considering that it's so simple, it's just point a camera in the film or the digital sensor takes an image. But it has all kinds of implications about representation and so many different kinds of interpretations. I mean, there's some people who look on the photograph actually as the subject itself, and there are others who look on it as a piece of paper, and there's every interpretation in between.
Yes. How many photographs do you take a day? I mean, I go out with a camera sometimes. I spend like 12 hours just wandering and never take a single frame. And I've read Cartier-Bresson where he said something that he maybe take one frame in a day if he's lucky and he's happy with it.
Take one frame or one good picture? I think it's one good picture.
No, one good picture, I guess.
That's maybe a big difference. Yeah.
Well, no, it is. Well, that's interesting too. Do you take a lot of shots I take
a lot of pictures. And,
do you?
Yeah, I do.
Well, that's interesting, because look at your work. It's so well composed, and it's so interesting in terms of the composition. And I want to quote you again. You say, "I'm always looking for something more. You take in too much. Perhaps it becomes total chaos," which is probably more like the world now. "I am playing along with that line, adding something more, yet keeping it short of chaos." But that's really interesting that you try and add so many things, but the end result seems so composed and so precise. Like the photograph on the cover of Under a Grudging Sun has the tree in the middle of frame and a guy with a hand pointing, and then there's either side there's people looking at you, which doesn't distract. It actually makes it more interesting because there's two things going on. But okay, how many frames did you take to get that one image?
That particular one, I mean, of course, it was a long time ago, but my recollection is that probably there weren't that many frames there. I would guess maybe 5 frames or something like that.
Well, that's interesting.
But there are other pictures. I mean, we think there's a very complex picture of mine from Istanbul in a barbershop through some mirrors and stuff. And my recollection is I probably took 6 rolls of film there.
Really?
Wow.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah.
It wasn't quite working. And it was a situation where I could continue working. I mean, sometimes, People get sick of you after 4 frames, and that's it, you know? So, you know, every situation is different. There are pictures of mine that have been 2 frames, and then there are others that have been many, many frames.
But are you actually, like in the barbershop, you're staying there because you know, you're in your head, you know the picture that you want?
I smell there's the possibility of a picture. Yeah.
There's another picture I want to ask you about, and I forget, I don't know where it's taken actually. It seems like it's on a bridge. On the left of frame, there's a bicycle and some legs of somebody that's riding the bicycle. And through this little piece of decorative hole, there's a surfer.
Yes.
How is that shot? That seems really...
It's a picture from Munich, and it's on the edge of the Englischer Gardens. And there is this spot there. There are these rapids in the little river or whatever it is there, where people surf, but they surf actually backwards. They jump out on their surfboards and they move backwards on their surfboards. And I mean, it's a very strange place. And and look, I had no idea when I took that picture that I had the surfer right there where it looks like, you know, the target sight of a gun. I mean, there was a different frame that I took that I thought when I took it actually was going to be the picture, but clearly this was the one. Look, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of serendipity involved in this process. And, you know, the more you're out there on the street, the more possibilities you have, more chances to fail.
Yeah. It seems like a lot of your pictures, people are reacting to you. And that, you know, there's a lot, some of them, yeah. And it almost helps the picture in a way. Mm-hmm. There's a black and white one in Le Cali, I think it is, where there's a young boy in a cemetery. He's near the camera. And then there's a rider on a horse in the background. Exactly. And the kid is looking at you.
Yes.
And there's something so melancholy about that.
No, I agree. I think that gaze, the picture wouldn't be what it is without that particular gaze. You're absolutely right. Yeah. I mean, you know, eye contact is tricky in photography because sometimes you feel that it's deeply significant, and somehow you feel like you're, you know, perceiving the soul of that person. And other times it feels like, oh, they're looking at the camera and it's just boring, you know, and it's very tricky as to how to evaluate that.
Yeah.
Especially since you have to do it on the fly.
Exactly.
You have to know right then.
Yeah. Well, you take the frame, and if it doesn't work, you edit it out. I mean, that's the easy answer.
Right. But how much, when you're seeing that, how much are you seeing the composition, or is it just about the content? Or is that just become natural to you now that you just feel what the shot is?
Look, I mean, I'm always very aware of the composition, but, you know, clearly I'm not seeing every little thing that's going on in the frame. But I mean, it's more like I sort of sense different elements simultaneously. And, you know, I might not be able to see that gesture there on the left, but I kind of feel the possibility of it. So when I'm coming back to look at the pictures, I'm hoping that gesture was as interesting as that sensation that I had when I took the picture.
It seems to me a lot of the most, some of the most perceptive films about America, movies, have been made by outsiders. And I'm thinking of like Wim Wenders' Paris, Texas, which is one of my favorite movies. You once said after 35 years of work as a photographer, you might be ready to photograph your own country. Do you feel now that you can see it with a fresh eye, or how? What did you mean by that?
Well, when I sort of discovered working in Haiti and along the U.S.-Mexico border in 1975, I was at a certain place in my life as a photographer. I was taking these sort of alienated pictures. It was right after the late 60s and Watergate. I was, you know, deeply disaffected by my country. Of course, I'm pretty disaffected right now, but that's another thing.
Welcome to again. Yeah.
And I went off to Haiti and the U.S.-Mexico border, and I really embraced the notion of photographing in a variety of places far from where I'm from. And about 10 years ago, I began to feel that I wanted to try and photograph the United States again, but I wanted to do it in a way that wasn't, you know, not sort of taking the route of sort of irony and alienation, but embracing something else about the United States, some way of trying to come to grips with this very strange country that I come from, because it is an extraordinarily strange place on many, many levels. And so since 2010, I've been photographing more and more in the United States. I mean, Rebecca, my wife, and I did a book on Rochester, New York. We recently did a book on Brooklyn. And I've been doing a series of photographs of American cities around the country over the last 6 years. I'm now not sure what the hell is going to happen to that project with the emergence of the pandemic and how that transforms the society. But there's some interesting photographs. And I think that some of them are beginning to do something interesting. We'll see. The United States is a complicated place to photograph. When I discovered working in Mexico, there was this sense of vibrancy and energy and life that is very different than what I feel in the streets of the United States. And, I don't have that same kind of excitement. So I'm just trying to figure it out. As I said, it's a way of trying to make sense of my country.
Your wife is a photographer also, right?
Yes.
And you guys work together?
We collaborate. Basically, we like to say that if we have one collaboration, we also always have two individual projects, and that's what makes the marriage work. It's like the collaboration is for the relationship. The individual projects are for the two egos.
Her work is, shall I say, is more poetic in a way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Has her work influenced yours?
I'm sure it has in some ways. I mean, I think, for instance, if you look at my Istanbul book, which is a book filled with layers upon layers and lots and lots of reflections, I did that work shortly after Rebecca brought out her first book, which was called The Glass Between Us, where she photographed animals in zoos, aquariums, and natural history museums around the world, often through glass. So there are lots of reflections. So though I think that my Istanbul work is definitely a response to Istanbul and the nature of Istanbul, I'm sure I was influenced some by her. But at the same time, we're kind of careful about boundaries. We do often have discussions about when one of us is stepping too much into the other person's turf. And we never photograph together. Our collaborations are only when we come together in the editing process.
That's interesting.
We work really independently. And I have to say that our first collaboration, which was the book Violet Isle on Cuba, I think one of the reasons it worked was because it happened organically, in that we were working on two separate projects for 15 years. And it wasn't until after our, I think it was ninth and penultimate trip to Cuba, that we thought about the possibility of bringing the work together as one body of work. And I think that, if we'd sort of set out in advance to do a collaboration, it might have been more problematic.
Did you approach it with caution? Say, yes. Well, should we do this?
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And then when it worked, we decided, okay, we can do this. We will do collaborations in the future. So we did. We've done several more.
Yeah. It's actually wonderful to be able to work together as we do also, because you're sharing your passion with your significant other. But
no, absolutely. I agree entirely.
It can be challenging too. But.
Yes, sure. But relationships are challenging anyway. So
right. So why not add it to the mix?
Exactly.
Especially when you can't go out.
Yeah.
I got another quote, okay?
Oh my God, aren't you sorry you said so much?
I suspect the world only gives a photographer so many intriguing images in a lifetime. Okay, how come you've made so many? It seems like you've got a lot of other people during your lifetime so far and more to come. No, is that just a product of the time you spend?
Well, some of it is certainly the time. I mean, I think there's no substitute for time in the streets, There are just more possibilities. But I also think that one learns to sort of know when to go places and so forth. I mean, it's almost a little bit like being a gambler. You try and get the odds as much in your favor as possible. Mm-hmm. You go out into situations that are potentially interesting to you. You go when the light seems potentially interesting. And every once in a while, the world gives you a little gift. Most of the time, it doesn't. I mean, this kind of work is 99.9% about failure, but you kind of accept that.
So there are days where you might not take a single frame.
Oh, no, no. I will almost always take some frames, but they'll not be particularly successful ones.
Right.
Yeah. No.
Right.
I mean, I just, lots and lots of images are on the cutting room floor.
Right. Right. Were you born with the ability to see these images, this sort of sense of something going to happen, sense of this moment? Or has it taken you, do you feel you've been learning your whole life? Just in terms of, finding the frame.
Sure. Well, look, I mean, I mentioned the fact that I come from a family of artists, and there's no doubt that I was taken to museums early on. And, I remember, for instance, at a very early age, loving de Chirico's work. And you can clearly see running through some of my Mexico work that kind of sense of enigma and so forth, the long shadows and so forth. Matisse and Braque as well. So all that stuff is there in the back of my head, not consciously, but it's just there. So, I mean, I think that I work from a place having experienced that stuff at an early age. I think that, I do think that working in the street or photography in general it's an active activity. I mean, I think that playing sports, knowing when to putting yourself in position in the street, on the sidewalk and so forth, anticipating movement, that's not so different than anticipating movement playing soccer or football, as you would call it. But I did play sports, so I mean, I think there's a physicality to it too that seems to work for me. Clearly my eye has been refined over the years and so forth, but I think you can see, if you look at some of my black and white work, you'll see glimmers of what will come later in color. It won't have the sensuality that the color brings, but at least in terms of the structure and in terms of a sense of the moment.
Right. You can see it's the same person behind it, I think. Yeah, there's the same personality. It's interesting you mentioned Giorgio de Chirico, because I had written down here the two people that I think, if you combine the work of Tony Ray Jones and Giorgio de Chirico, I think you'll get Alex Webb.
There you go.
Because there's the playfulness of Tony Ray Jones's photographs of basically England and the aristocracy and all the rest, and that wonderful sense of threat or the mystery of de Chirico's surrealist paintings.
I can relate to that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. How do you feel when, I mean, I get this, what I do in film is sometimes intensely analyzed, like, why did you use this light? Why did you do this? Why this composition? And I've got no answer. Have you got an answer?
For your photographs,
you're
asked.
Yeah.
No. I mean, I think it's a very intuitive process. And after all, trying to explain in words about something that's essentially visual, it's like trying to do a dance about a piece of architecture.
Right. It always makes me smile when somebody sort of tries to analyze.
I think we live in a world in which people expect you to be able to say something that encompasses whatever it is you're doing, but ultimately the only way to really experience whatever it is to see the work itself.
Yeah. And do you think there's more outlets now for your work, photographers such as you, or less? How do you feel the world?
Well, I mean, it really depends. I mean, my outlets are certainly somewhat different than they were when I began as a photographer. I've always been oriented towards making books. I mean, that's it's the way I first experienced photographs, and I still love them. And I do like doing exhibitions a lot. But, in terms of survival as a photographer, the assignment landscape has been utterly transformed. I mean, when I became a professional photographer in 1974, they were already saying photojournalism is dead. I mean, it was after sort of the demise of Life and Look. And so making a good living as a photojournalist was no longer really possible. You cobbled together a living, and I cobbled together a living by working for Geo and sometimes National Geographic and this obscure European magazine or whatever for many years. But now that's gone. I really don't do much in the way of magazine work these days. I get occasional odd commissions that sometimes, which are very interesting, sometimes less so. But I do feel that just because I've been around for a long time and I have a track record of books and exhibitions, actually there's more possibility in recent years of my work appearing the way I want it to appear than there was 40 years ago, definitely, because I can get a book out now. I can sometimes convince a museum or a gallery to do an exhibition. That didn't exist that way many years ago. But in terms of being a professional photographer, a traditional assignment photographer, it's really a joke these days.
Right. And I mean, because I guess it's the advent of the iPhone, it's like you've seen just recently with the George Floyd or whatever. It seems protests. Like the image, the news images are now coming from people's iPhones, the images that actually have a significant change or influence on the news cycle.
I think it's not just news, because I think that's, I never was a news photographer as such. I did sometimes cover news, but it wasn't predominantly. I always did, what they would call in magazines features. But I think that, the outlets for the kinds of work that I did have just dried up as well. The presence of the internet, the cost of paper, there are many, many fewer magazines than there used to be. So that's just much less there than it was.
I'm interested. I saw some of your photographs of Cape Cod. They reminded me Don McCullum, where he kind of basically gave up photographing the war and he started making these wonderful landscapes of Yorkshire and the English countryside. Is that an equivalent what you're doing in Cape Cod?
Well, the work from Cape Cod is a little bit of an experiment at this point. Yeah. It's kind of work that I've done a little bit while I've been up here, and I've actually been doing quite a lot during the pandemic. I still am trying to figure out my real feelings about it, whether I think it's interesting or successful or anything of the sort. I think I have a few pictures, but it's a limited number. I spent many summers as a child on Cape Cod, and it is the landscape that I feel sort of most at ease in anywhere in the world. And it's where I love to edit, work, put together books. It's a place that encourages deep reflection. But it's very different than most of the places I photograph, where there's a sense of energy in the streets. They're very urban. The photographs I've been taking here have almost never have any people in them. The colors are extremely muted. They're medium format panoramic pictures. If it wasn't for the pandemic, I certainly wouldn't be doing these pictures now, and it's work that I kind of thought that I would concentrate once I felt incapable of walking the streets anymore. But I do feel like it's an honest response to what is out there for me. So on some level, I don't feel it's drastically different in spirit than the rest of my work, but in many, many ways it is, because it's so, the kind of energy in it is so different. It's this sort of muted Zen-like quality. It's not the sort of intensity and movement that much of my urban work has. So, but I'm glad I'm doing something here,
Yeah, no, really, yeah.
I wish I was out photographing around the United States and and working on this cities project. But I think that getting on a plane and staying in motels right now for a 68-year-old is probably not the best thing in the world.
Yeah. Do you do much? I just want to ask a sort of technical question, really. Do you do much in post when you print your photographs? Do you enhance them? The blacks are always so deep, and
most of the work that you've seen actually is from film originally, and then because till 2010 I worked entirely in film. It wasn't until 2010 that I started working more digitally, and that took place when Kodachrome was discontinued.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Because for basically almost all my life as a color photographer, I worked in Kodachrome, which has a particular quality to it, which does include a kind of certain kinds of deep blacks and deep reds.
Mm-hmm.
So
High
I do
contrast,
and it felt sort of the weight of Kodachrome felt right for the weight of the subjects that I was photographing early on in Haiti and along the U.S.-Mexico border. So if you look at my prints, they're not exactly the same as the original slides, but they're not that different. I mean, sure, I probably opened things up a little bit, but in that kind of light where you do have those deep blacks and this sort of sense of negative space, I let that happen, whether it's in Kodachrome or whether it's in digital. I mean, I make sure I have the highlights and I'll let the dark areas go.
Do you do your own printing?
I don't do my own final prints. I do my own work prints, sort of to figure out what it is, the pictures that I want to do but the final prints, no. I mean, I use a process that I make digital C prints, which are made on a Lambda or LightJet machine, and it's a huge $250,000 machine. So I would be unlikely to have that sitting in my studio.
Yeah, right.
These days, look, obviously inkjet prints are quite wonderful these days, and maybe, I don't know, there's a part of me that just has felt with getting to the prints that I really want, that if I do that, I'm not going to really be out there photographing very much because the amount of time that to get to the place where I can make the kinds of prints that Esteban, the printer that Rebecca and I both use, could make, would take me years. I better to spend my time out there seeing if I can take a few more pictures.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah. Also, I just wanted to ask you, how did it affect your life being part of Magnum? Is that very significant? Did that involve you with a lot of other photographers?
Well, I mean, look, I think that I actually was brought to Magnum by Charlie Harbit. Charlie was president of Magnum actually when I came in.
Right, yeah.
And, that what I think was significant to me about Magnum was all of a sudden making me realize that I could expand my horizons tremendously in terms of what was possible to do. That, I read Graham Greene's The Comedians, but I was sort of open to the possibility of getting on a plane and going to Haiti because I saw there were these other photographers who were going off. It was a time back then where, you didn't have people flying around the globe the way they did, 8 months ago. So, it was kind of a big deal to get on a plane and go to Haiti, It's a big deal to go to the US-Mexico border and wander around. People weren't really doing that very much. So, and so Magnum sort of opened that up to me. In my early days of Magnum, and I think this is not unusual for Magnum photographers, is that there were a few other photographers that I was quite close to, and we were sort of going through some of the same kinds of things in our lives as photographers. So we saw a lot of one another and conferred a lot. I think as one gets older within Magnum, one's life becomes more complicated. You have other kinds of commitments, and Magnum takes an increasingly small role in one's life. So, I'm part of Magnum, but I don't really have that much to do with it. My primary photographic relationship, of course, is with Rebecca, my wife. And, there are a few other photographers who both of us show work to sometimes, and they actually happen not to be in Magnum. So, for whatever reason.
I think we need to ask this question for the people who don't know. What is Magnum?
Okay. So Magnum is a photographic agency. It was founded right after the Second World War by Cartier-Bresson, George Roger, David Seymour, and Robert Capa. And it was an agency that was founded, among other things, to protect photographers' rights. At that point, Life magazine and the other magazines wanted to own all rights to all photographers' material. Wow. And Magnum fought against that, refused to work with Life, and ultimately it was established that photographers own their own copyright.
Great.
I think it was also an agency founded out of a certain kind of optimism after the Second World War, that there was a belief, a sort of a humanitarian belief, a belief in human possibility in contrast to what had happened in the Second World War.
Hmm.
And it's an agency that sort of invented the notion, which enabled photographers to make a living as editorial photographers, of distribution, which is that, I don't know, you do a project and you sell it to Life magazine, but at the same time you make 10 sets of the same prints and they go to Stern magazine and Paris Match and some Norwegian magazine or whatever, and you can actually recoup what you spent making those pictures and live off of the income from multiple publications across many platforms.
Great.
That has basically disappeared entirely, particularly with the internet. So there are lots of questions about what is the meaning of a photographic agency in 2020, and that's what Magnum is facing.
I think we should say to any of the listeners that are interested in photography, though, that the Magnum website is a wonderful research tool to look at the different possibilities in photography. You go there and you see the infinite range of personalities in a way, don't you, in the work you see there?
Sure, and the work has become, as the photography world has expanded in different directions, the range of different kinds of photographers has expanded tremendously, which also makes it more complicated for an agency to represent them, because how do you represent all those people? They're so different.
Yeah.
The one thing I wanted to ask, just so people get to know about this, is you do a lot of workshops, don't you? What do you do in the workshops?
Yeah, Rebecca and I have been teaching workshops now for more than 20 years, I guess. Well, we actually do 3 different kinds of workshops. There's sort of a 2 or 3 day workshop, which is really sort of more introductory and involves our giving a number of presentations and looking at their work, and they may have 1 or 2 days of photographing in it, or 1 or 2 days of editing, depending on what they want to do, depending on who they are. Some people come to the workshop with a body of work that they want to edit. The traditional workshops, though, that we teach are 5 or 6 day workshops, and in those workshops, we meet with people in the morning, and basically they go out and photograph in the afternoon. They edit, select their pictures. They come in early the next morning. We look at their work. We re-edit. They go out that afternoon. And over the period of 5 or 6 days, they build a little tiny body of work. And in these workshops, we encourage them very much to work spontaneously, intuitively, be guided by their emotions, not be thinking too much about things, just try and follow their intuition. The other workshop that we sometimes teach is either bookmaking or editing workshop. And in that one, people come with work that already exists, and we work with them over a period of days, sequencing the work, first cutting it down, sequencing it. For one of the workshops, we actually bring in a few designers who come and make a cover, sort of as an idea of a potential cover for a book. So those are, and I think the thing that's really good about it is that Rebecca and I do it together. And I used to teach some workshops occasionally on my own, and I find that the dialogue that goes on between Rebecca and myself is really good. And it's also good because even if we're saying the same thing, we say it different ways, and so certain people will understand it much better from her, and other people will understand it better from me. So it's an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, I can imagine. I do have one question. What is editing in still photography?
Selecting.
Oh, selecting.
Selecting pictures, yeah. Sorry. No, because it's a word that's misused all the time these days in photography, because now they talk about editing digital files, meaning toning digital files.
Right.
Editing is making a selection of pictures.
Well, that's a point, actually, editing. When you've taken a picture, do you crop it, or do you always stick with the same framing?
I don't crop. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that's really up to the individual photographer. I mean, I like the notion of capturing it all in camera. And if it didn't work, well, it didn't work.
Yeah.
I can always take another picture. But there are photographers, you look at William Klein's work, there are pictures in his New York book, I think, that started out as horizontals and are verticals in the book. So certainly Frank cropped. Cartier-Bresson claimed he never cropped. So, I think it's a totally individual decision.
Cool.
And if people wanted more information on the workshops, is there a website?
Yes, it's www.webnorriswebb.co, not com. Someone stole com from us, so it's .co.
Oh.
And now takes you to some Japanese car company or something. I don't know.
Thanks for listening. If you want more information and further discussion, check out the forums at www.rogerdeakins.com. Becoming a member is free, and you can ask follow-up questions there. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more new questions and topics. Also, check us out on Instagram at team.deakins. See you next time.